The dream didn't have the clean, logical syntax of a C++ script. It was rendered in high-contrast charcoal and wet ink. The fluorescent lights in the telecom hub hummed at a frequency Elias had long ago tuned out. It was a Tuesday, the most invisible day of the week. He sat in his ergonomically correct chair, staring at a spreadsheet of signal-to-noise ratios that felt like it had no beginning and no end. He spent 40 minutes troubleshooting a faulty junction box in a suburb he'd never visited. It was tedious, low-stakes work. He was the guy people called when their internet stuttered, a ghost in a high-vis vest. "Elias, you got the quarterly logs?" his supervisor asked, leaning over the cubicle wall with a lukewarm coffee. "Almost done, Pete," Elias replied, not looking up. His voice was as flat as the gray carpet. "Good man. Don't forget the department potluck tomorrow. I think Brenda's bringing that weird bean dip again." Elias offered a polite, practiced chuckle. This was his world. Bean dips, quarterly logs, and the slow, rhythmic ticking of a clock that promised nothing but a pension in 30 years. When 5 p.m. finally crawled across the dial, he walked out to the parking lot. His car was a silver sedan, the most common color on the road, chosen specifically because it was easy to clean and hard to notice. It had a slight rattle in the dashboard that he'd been meaning to fix for 6 months, but never quite found the energy for. He drove home through the same 3.4 miles of traffic he navigated every day. He stopped at the grocery store for a gallon of 2% milk and a box of plain crackers. When he pulled into the driveway, Sarah was out front, watering the hydrangeas. In her sun hat and gardening gloves, she looked like the portrait of suburban stability. It was hard to remember that 3 years ago, when they first met, he had actually been intimidated by her. She'd been a high-energy litigator then, sharp-tongued and prone to staying out until 3 a.m. at underground jazz clubs. He thought she was dangerous, the kind of woman who would burn a life down just to see the colors of the flames. But time and the looming wedding had filed her down. Now, she was worried about the guest list and the price of peonies. She was safe. She was peaceful. She was his normal. "Hey, honey," she called out, waving a trowel. "Did you remember the milk?" "In the bag," he said, walking up the path. He kissed her cheek. It smelled like sunscreen and potting soil. "Perfect," the wedding planner called. "We need to finalize the seating for your side of the family tonight. It's going to be a long evening." Elias nodded, feeling the comfortable, boring weight of his life settling over his shoulders. "I'll get the wine open." He went inside, tossed his keys in the ceramic bowl on the entryway table, and reached into his work trousers to empty his pockets. Elias sat at the kitchen table with the seating chart sprawled out between the salt shaker and a half-eaten plate of chicken. The television was murmuring in the background, a local news report about a water main break downtown, adding a layer of white noise to the evening. "So," Sarah said, tapping her pen against her chin, "if we put your Aunt Martha at table 4, we have to move the Miller cousins to table 7. But table 7 is right by the speakers, and you know how they complain about the volume." Elias stared at the little pink and blue sticky notes. This was the biggest crisis of his week, the acoustic comfort of distant relatives. He leaned back, the linoleum of the chair sticking slightly to his work shirt. His back ached with the specific, dull throb that comes from sitting in a cubicle for 8 hours. Sarah laughed, a soft, tired sound. "Fair point." She moved the sticky notes. The wedding was a massive, slow-moving machine, and tonight they were just 2 more cogs doing the maintenance. "I'm going to start a load of laundry," she said, standing up and stretching. "Can you finish the tally for the vegetarian meals? The caterer needs the final count by Friday." "On it," Elias replied. He sat in the silence of the kitchen, the only sound the rhythmic thump-thump of the washing machine starting up in the next room. He looked at the list of names. Johnson, Peterson, Miller, Stevens. A roll call of people who lived lives just like his. People who bought insurance, worried about their lawns, and slept in rooms with beige walls. He picked up the pen and started to check off the boxes. One by one, a quiet, orderly accounting of a quiet, orderly life. He reached for his glass of water, his mind drifting toward tomorrow's schedule. More logs, more signal-to-noise ratios, more gray carpet. He felt a strange, hollow sensation in his chest, not quite sadness, just a deep, jurisdictional boredom. He finished the list, capped his pen, and stood up to turn off the kitchen light. The house was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator. Sarah stood with the door open, pointing to 3 neatly labeled Tupperware containers stacked on the middle shelf. "Okay, so tomorrow is the lemon chicken," she said, her voice soft in the dim kitchen light. "Thursday is the pasta bake, and I left the salad dressing on the side so it doesn't get soggy. Don't just order pizza the second I leave, Elias." He smiled, leaning against the counter. "I think I can manage a microwave for 3 days. I'm serious. Aunt Beth's house is a dead zone for cell service, so don't freak out if I don't text back right away. I'm just going to be drinking tea and looking at her garden." She closed the fridge and wrapped her arms around his waist. "You sure you're okay with the 4 a.m. wake-up call for the airport?" "It's fine," Elias said, kissing the top of her head. "I'll drop you off, come back, and maybe get an hour of sleep before the shift starts. It's a boring Tuesday anyway. Nothing ever happens on Tuesdays." They headed to bed early, the room filled with the familiar, comforting sounds of their routine. The clicking of the bedside lamp, the rustle of the duvet, the rhythmic breathing of 2 people whose lives were perfectly synced. Elias fell asleep quickly, his mind blissfully empty of anything but the next day's mundane schedule. The drive to the airport was a blur of orange streetlights and empty highways. Sarah chatted nervously about her aunt's health and the wedding invitations, her voice the only thing keeping him tethered to the waking world. When they pulled up to the departure's curb, the air was crisp and smelled of jet fuel and early morning damp. "I'll call you when I land," she said, grabbing her carry-on from the back seat. She gave him one last, lingering kiss, a taste of mint and home. "I love you. Try not to miss me too much." "Love you too," Elias replied, watching her disappear into the sliding glass doors of the terminal. The drive back was a different route, a shortcut through the industrial district where the streetlights were spaced further apart. At 5 a.m., the rough part of town wasn't dangerous, it was just tired. He rolled past a row of shuttered storefronts and a Gothic-looking club called the Ossuary, its neon sign flickering a weak, dying violet against the gray sky. A few women stood on the corner, huddled in oversized coats, their breath visible in the pre-dawn chill. Elias didn't look away, but he didn't slow down either. He just felt a strange, distant curiosity, a ripple in the flat water of his life. He reached into the center console and pulled out a cracked jewel case. He popped a worn copy of Disintegration into the player. The opening chords of Plainsong filled the cabin, the heavy, shimmering synths matching the gloom of the passing warehouses. It was the music of his 20-year-old self, a version of Elias that had disappeared long ago under signal-to-noise ratios and wedding spreadsheets. He got home to an apartment that felt cavernous without Sarah's presence. He didn't go back to sleep. Instead, he showered, shaved, and put on the same pair of charcoal slacks he wore every Wednesday. He ate his cereal in silence, staring at the empty chair across from him. Work was a carbon copy of the day before. He sat in his cubicle, the fluorescent hum a steady companion. He processed 17 service tickets. He ate a turkey sandwich at his desk. He listened to Pete complain about his lawnmower for 15 minutes during the afternoon lull. The Cure lyrics looped in the back of his mind, a low-frequency hum of melancholy that made the spreadsheets seem even more meaningless than usual. By 5 p.m., his eyes ached from the monitor glare. He walked out to the silver sedan, the sun already dipping low and casting long, skeletal shadows across the asphalt. He was a man with 3 nights of total, unmonitored freedom ahead of him. The lemon chicken stayed in the fridge. Elias stood before the hallway mirror, feeling like a forger. He dug the black jeans out from the bottom of a plastic bin in the closet. They were tight, smelling of cedar and old dust. He pulled on the Cure shirt, the fabric thin and soft from a decade of washes, and zipped the leather jacket. It felt heavy, like a suit of armor. He looked at his reflection and didn't see the telecom tech or the groom-to-be. He saw a ghost of someone he used to be. He drove back to the industrial district. The ossuary was fully awake now. The air inside was a physical weight, a humid soup of dry ice, clove cigarettes, and the sharp, metallic tang of unwashed hair. The band on the small, raised stage was a wall of noise, slow, sludge-filled bass that vibrated in Elias's molars, and a drummer who hit the cymbals with a rhythmic, wet thud. He stood at the bar, his chest thumping in time with the kick drum. He ordered a double whiskey. He didn't see the hand that hovered over his glass, but he felt the change almost instantly after the first long swallow. The world didn't just blur, it curdled. The music didn't hit his ears anymore. It hit his marrow. Every bass note felt like a forensic probe sliding between his ribs. The red and violet strobe lights began to skip, leaving trails of toxic neon static in his vision. The smell of the room shifted. The clove smoke vanished, replaced by the suffocating, pressurized reek of ancient, rotting kelp and cold salt. It was a smell of the deep, a stench of things that had never seen the sun. His tongue felt like a slab of wet soap. He looked down at his hands, and they looked miles away, the skin translucent and gray, the veins underneath pulsing with a dark, oily fluid that moved with a high-speed, fluid logic. A girl stepped out of the violet haze. She was a glitch in the film. Her hair was a matted, ink-black nest, and her skin was decorated with intricate, weeping tattoos of obsidian needles. When she spoke, her voice didn't come from her throat. It was a low-frequency hum that vibrated directly into his brain. "You look like you're searching for something," she whispered. She leaned in, and the smell of her was overwhelming, a cloying, chemical mix of burnt plastic and lavender. It was the smell of a terminal fire. Her eyes weren't eyes. They were two unblinking, red pixels that flickered in the dark. She reached out and traced a finger down his leather sleeve. To his drugged mind, the sound of her nail on the leather was a deafening, rhythmic screech, like metal being torn by a high-pressure hydraulic. "The town is open tonight," she said, her mouth unhinging just a fraction too wide, revealing rows of needle-thin teeth. "Do you want to see the other side?" Elias couldn't answer. His throat was filled with a heavy, golden weight, the taste of molten brass and bitter brine. He could only watch as the walls of the club began to weep a black, translucent oil, and the ceiling seemed to stretch upward into a vast, lightless abyss. "Hey!" The word didn't come from a mouth. It felt like it was pressed directly against the side of his neck. She smelled like stale cloves and a sharp, stinging chemical, like nail polish remover or industrial cleaner. It burned the back of his throat. She reached out, and her fingers were ice cold as they slid under the cuff of his leather jacket, grazing his wrist. The sensation sent a jolt of static through his arms. Elias tried to focus on her, but her features kept shifting. One second she had a kind, bored expression. The next her eyes seemed to sink into deep, hollow pits of shadow. I think I need to sit down," Elias stammered, his tongue feeling 3 sizes too big for his mouth. "I have a better place to sit," she whispered. She leaned in closer, the chemical smell of her skin becoming suffocating. She grabbed his hand, her grip surprisingly strong, and began to lead him through the thrashing, sweaty bodies on the dance floor. To Elias, the people were no longer human. They were shifting, gray shapes, a forest of limbs and noise that he had to fight through. The air grew thicker, hotter, as she pulled him toward a heavy steel door at the back of the club. The apartment was a low-ceilinged cave that smelled of smoldering sage and warm, melting wax. She pushed him onto a mattress that felt like it was made of thick, viscous honey. Elias's body had lost its edges. His limbs were trailing off into the sheets like smoke. He felt the weight of his own bones, each one vibrating at a frequency that made the room glow in pulsing neon magentas and electric cyans. "You're crashing," she whispered, her voice echoing as if they were standing at the bottom of a marble canyon. "This will level the field." She pressed a small, translucent strip against his tongue. It tasted of bitter copper and crushed violets. The world didn't just stabilize, it shattered into 1,000 prismatic shards. The euphoria hit like a tidal wave of warm, liquid gold, rushing up his spine and exploding behind his eyes. The ceiling vanished, replaced by a swirling, kaleidoscopic nebula of deep indigo and shimmering silver. He wasn't breathing air anymore. He was inhaling pure, velvet light. She moved around the bed with a fluid, terrifying grace, lighting dozens of black candles. The flames didn't flicker. They grew into tall, steady pillars of obsidian fire that cast shadows that seemed to dance independently of her body. She crawled toward him, her skin looking like translucent porcelain. He could see the faint, glowing map of her veins beneath, pulsing with a soft, bioluminescent green. She leaned over him, her hair falling like a curtain of cool silk across his face. "Do you love me?" she asked. The question wasn't a sound. It was a physical sensation, a rhythmic throb in his chest that felt like a needle being pulled through silk. She traced the line of his jaw with a finger that felt like a hot wire. Every place she touched left a trail of sparking, iridescent embers on his skin. He tried to speak, but his voice was a cloud of iridescent bubbles that drifted away into the rafters. The room was melting into a blur of fuchsia and deep-sea blue, the walls breathing in and out in time with his frantic, drug-addled heart. She leaned in closer, her breath smelling of black licorice and ozone, her eyes expanding until they were two infinite violet oceans. "Say it," she commanded, her grip on his shoulders feeling like iron bands. "Tell me you love me." Elias felt his normal life, Sarah, the wedding, the silver sedan, dissolving like wet tissue paper in the heat of the euphoria. He was drowning in the translucent, vibrating glow of the room, his consciousness stretching until it felt thin enough to break. The room didn't just vibrate. It groaned under the weight of a sensory overdose. As she straddled him, the euphoria curdled into something violent and primal. The candles flared into towering pillars of liquid violet flame, and the walls of the apartment began to pulse like the interior of a massive, living throat. She wasn't just a woman anymore. In his hallucination, her skin became a translucent, shimmering membrane through which he could see her skeleton, glowing like white-hot neon. When she moved against him, it wasn't the friction of skin on skin. It was the collision of two tectonic plates. Every touch sent jagged bolts of electric crimson through his nervous system, a pleasure so sharp it felt like a forensic carving. The voices started then, 1,000 overlapping whispers that crawled out of the shadows and into his ears. "Do you love me? Traitor. Husband. Me." They weren't just in a room. They were inside the rhythm of his blood. The music from the club downstairs bled through the floorboards, but it had transformed into a slow, wet thrumming, like a giant heart beating in the basement. As the act turned ravaging, her face began to shift with every strobe light pulse of his vision. 1 second, she was the girl from the bar, her lips a bruised purple. The next, her features melted away, replaced by the terrifying, vacant perfection of a porcelain mask. Then, for a heart-stopping moment, he saw Sarah, her eyes wide with a cold, glassy horror, before the vision shattered into a spray of iridescent sparks. He gripped her hips, his fingers sinking into her flesh as if it were made of warm, heavy wax. The air was thick with the scent of burnt sugar, copper, and that stinging industrial chemical, a smell that made his lungs feel like they were being lined with velvet. She arched her back, her hair whipping around her like a nest of black eels. Her voice rose in a guttural, low-frequency moan that shook the marrow in his bones. "Tell me," she hissed, her teeth grazing his earlobe, a sensation that felt like a shattering of glass across his entire body. Elias felt his consciousness tearing. He wasn't in a bedroom anymore. He was a star collapsing in on itself, a mess of heat, friction, and fluid. The colors of the room, the fuchsias, the deep-sea blues, the toxic oranges, swirled into a single, blinding white void at the center of his skull. He lunged into her, desperate to anchor himself to the physical sensation. But the more he fought for reality, the more the world dissolved into a prismatic, screaming chaos. The ceiling seemed to drop, the mattress rose to meet it, and he was caught in the middle, a rhythmic, frantic liquidation of everything he had ever been. Beep, beep, beep. The digital clock on the milk crate beside his mattress flashed 5:30 a.m. in a toxic red glow. Elias bolted upright, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The air in the bedroom was still, smelling of nothing but the faint, familiar scent of the detergent Sarah used. He sat there for a long minute, his hands gripping the duvet, waiting for the neon fuchsias and the screaming voices to return. But there was only silence. He looked at his palms. They weren't translucent. They were just his hands, dry, calloused, and mundane. There were no iridescent embers, no black ink, no scent of burnt plastic. Just a dream, he whispered, the words sounding thin in the early morning quiet. Just the drugs. Just the stress. He got out of bed, his joints feeling stiff but remarkably human. He showered, the hot water scrubbing away the phantom sensation of wax and silk. He dressed in his usual work uniform, the sturdy boots, the denim work shirt, the belt with the heavy pliers. He looked in a mirror while he brushed his teeth, searching for a mark, a tattoo, a sign, but his neck was clear. He was just Elias again. He drove to work, the silver sedan rattling in the same spot on the dashboard. The sun was a flat, uninspired disk behind a layer of gray clouds. He stopped for a coffee at the usual drive-thru, the cashier giving him the same bored, "Have a nice day," she gave him every morning. The day was so aggressive in its normalcy that the night before began to feel like a movie he'd watched years ago. The Gothic club, the girl, the violet flames, it was all receding, losing its color and its heat. By 3 p.m., he was convinced it had been a particularly vivid hallucination brought on by a bad drink and pre-wedding jitters. He was safe. He was boring. He was fine. He finished his shift at 5 p.m. and walked out to the parking lot, the evening air smelling of damp pavement and car exhaust. He felt a profound sense of relief. Sarah would be home in 2 days, and this weird, dark glitch in his life would be over. He reached into his pocket for his car keys. His fingers brushed against a small, rectangular piece of plastic. The relief of the day's routine was like a heavy blanket. By the time Elias pulled into his driveway, the vivid, neon-soaked memories of the club felt less like a memory and more like a fever dream he'd finally broken. He walked into the silent kitchen, the air still and smelling of the lemon-scented cleaner Sarah liked. He didn't turn on the big overhead light, opting for the soft glow of the stove clock. He opened the fridge. There they were, the 3 neat Tupperware containers Sarah had prepared with such domestic care. He took out the lemon chicken. He stared at it for a long time. The cold, congealed sauce looked gray in the dim light. The thought of eating it, of sitting at the table alone and participating in the normal life Sarah had laid out for him, made his stomach twist with a sudden, sharp pang of guilt. He grabbed the second container, the pasta bake meant for Thursday, and walked out the back door into the cool evening air. The neighborhood was quiet, just the distant hum of the highway and the occasional bark of a dog 3 streets over. He walked to the chain-link fence at the edge of the yard. Buster, the neighbor's aging chocolate lab, trotted over, his tail thumping rhythmically against the dirt. "Here you go, buddy," Elias whispered, popping the lid and sliding the pasta onto a flat stone near the fence. He watched the dog eat. Buster didn't care about signal-to-noise ratios or wedding invitations. He didn't care about the smell of clove cigarettes or the way a girl's skin looked under a violet strobe. He just ate, his movements simple and honest. Elias went back inside and ate the lemon chicken standing up over the sink, shoving the cold meat into his mouth just to get it over with. He washed the container, dried it, and put it back in the exact spot it had occupied before. The house was a vacuum. He went into the living room and sat on the sofa, not turning on the TV. He just sat in the dark, his hands resting on his knees, listening to the silence. He felt like a man waiting for a storm that might never come. The phone rang, cutting through the heavy silence of the kitchen like a siren. Elias jumped, his heart skipping a beat before he saw Sarah's face on the screen. "Hey," she said, her voice sounding thin and distant, likely from the poor reception at her aunt's. "Just wanted to say goodnight. I miss you. It's too quiet here." "I miss you too," Elias said, his voice steadying as he leaned against the counter. Hearing her made the previous night feel like a shameful, impossible hallucination. The house is empty without you. I just ate the chicken. It was great. Good. Only 2 more days, Elias. I love you. The click of the end call was like a door slamming shut. He stood there for a second, feeling the warmth of her voice leave the room, replaced by the low hum of the refrigerator. He hadn't locked it. He watched as the knob turned with a slow, deliberate grace. The girl from the club stepped into the hallway. She wasn't wearing the heavy leather now. She was in a thin, translucent slip that looked like oil on water, her dark hair damp, as if she'd walked through a storm that didn't exist. "You lied to her," she whispered. Her voice wasn't a rasp anymore. It was a siren's hum that vibrated the floorboards beneath his feet. Before he could protest, she was across the room. She didn't walk. She blurred. She shoved him back against the sofa, her hands cold as marble, and pressed a small, bitter-tasting pellet against his tongue. The drug hit his system like a lightning strike of liquid neon. The living room didn't just change, it dissolved. The beige walls began to weep a shimmering, iridescent fluid, and the ceiling rose into a vast, violet-tinted cathedral of shadow. The scent of Sarah's lemon cleaner was violently incinerated, replaced by the suffocating, heavy perfume of cloves, musk, and cold, pressurized copper. She fell upon him with a ravaging, forensic hunger. Elias was caught in a tempest of shifting geometry. One moment he was on the sofa, the next he felt like he was floating in a viscous, electric sea. The hallucinations returned with a vengeance. Voices from the walls screaming in a rhythmic, guttural chant that matched the frantic thudding of his heart. The colors were shattering, toxic oranges and deep-sea magentas strobing behind his eyelids as she tore at his clothes. Every touch was an explosion of prismatic sparks, a physical pleasure so intense it felt like his nerves were being unspooled and rewoven into a pattern of pure, unadulterated heat. He looked up at her, but her face was a kaleidoscope of shifting features, sometimes the girl, sometimes a masked entity, sometimes just a void of violet light. "Do you love me, Elias?" she hissed, her teeth grazing his throat in a way that sent a shattering vibration through his spine. He was drowning in the translucent, vibrating chaos of his own living room, the normal world of wedding invites and Tupperware lost somewhere beneath the crashing waves of the high. Beep, beep, beep. The alarm was a rhythmic ice pick to his skull. Elias woke up face down on the living room rug, the taste of stale copper and ash coating his tongue. The room looked offensively normal in the weak morning light. No violet flames, no weeping walls, just the dusty sunlight hitting the coffee table and the empty Tupperware on the counter. His body felt like a bruised instrument, but he forced himself into the shower. He scrubbed until his skin was raw, desperate to wash off the phantom scent of cloves and musk. Work was a waking coma. He sat in his cubicle, the flickering fluorescent lights overhead feeling like a slow-motion interrogation. Pete talked for 20 minutes about a new irrigation system for his lawn, and Elias just nodded, his mind a blank field of gray static. He was a ghost in a denim shirt, going through the motions of a man who still had a life to return to. When 5 p.m. finally hit, he drove home in a state of brittle exhaustion. All he wanted was to sleep until Sarah got back, to reset the clock and pretend this week had never happened. He pulled into the driveway, the silver sedan's dashboard rattle sounding like a taunt. He walked to the front door, his keys heavy in his hand. There, tucked into the doorframe at eye level, was a plain white envelope. Inside, he found a single Polaroid and a scrap of notebook paper. The photo was a forensic nightmare, high contrast and jagged. It showed him on the living room sofa, his face contorted in a drug-addled, ecstatic trance, the girl's ink-black hair draped over his chest like a shroud. In the background, the framed photo of him and Sarah from their last vacation was clearly visible on the mantel, a perfect, silent witness to the betrayal. The note was short, written in a cramped, aggressive hand. $20,000 by tomorrow night. Leave it in the trash, can behind the ossuary. If the bag isn't there, Sarah gets the high-res version in her inbox the second she lands. Don't be a glitch, Elias. Elias felt the air leave his lungs. The quiet, boring safety of the neighborhood suddenly felt like a thin glass cage about to shatter. He looked at the neighbor's house, wondering if Buster the dog had seen her slip the note in. He stood in his entryway, the silent house pressing in on him, the scent of Sarah's lemon cleaner now smelling like a funeral. The bank teller didn't blink as she counted out the stacks of hundreds. To her, Elias was just another groom-to-be making a big withdrawal for a venue or a caterer. He felt like a man carrying a corpse in a suitcase. He drove to the industrial district, the leather jacket feeling like a shroud. He found her behind the ossuary, standing in the shadow of a rusted fire escape. She didn't look like a hallucination now. In the gray afternoon light, she looked small, sharp, and predatory. He shoved the bag of wedding fund cash into her hands. He didn't say a word. He didn't even wait for her to check it. He just turned and walked away, the sound of his own boots on the gravel sounding like a rhythmic, hollow heartbeat. He drove home and threw up in the kitchen sink, the lemon-scented air of the apartment feeling like a mockery. The days that followed were a jurisdictional blur. Sarah came home, glowing and rested. She talked about the wedding favors and the seating chart, and Elias played his part with a forensic precision. He smiled when he was supposed to smile. He kissed her with lips that felt like they were made of wood. Inside, he was a hollowed-out shell, his mind a constant, rhythmic loop of the violet flames and the smell of cloves. The night before the wedding, the pressure finally cracked. He was in a hotel room, the night before, tradition keeping him away from Sarah. He fell into a sleep that felt like a descent into a lightless abyss. In the dream, he was standing at the altar. The church was a cathedral of obsidian and ice, the pews filled with faceless, gray figures in suits. He reached out to pull back the heavy, lace veil of his bride. His hands were trembling. As the fabric cleared, it wasn't Sarah's warm, familiar face. It was the girl from the club. Her skin was a translucent, glowing porcelain, her eyes two unblinking, red pixels. She leaned in, the scent of burnt plastic and lavender suffocating him, and whispered into his marrow, "Do you love me, Elias?" The wedding was a masterpiece of suburban normalcy. The sun was out, the flowers were fresh, and the minister spoke about commitment and the long road ahead. Elias stood there in his tuxedo, his heart a dull, quiet ache. When he lifted Sarah's veil, she was just Sarah, beautiful, trusting, and blissfully unaware. He said, "I do." He kissed her. The crowd cheered. The starry script of his betrayal was buried deep, deep beneath the floorboards of his new life. The reception was a whirlwind of champagne toasts and bad dancing. As the sun set and the party shifted into the late-night hours, Elias found himself standing alone on the balcony of the reception hall, looking out at the city lights. The honeymoon was supposed to be the reset button, but the normal world was already hemorrhaging. As Elias shoved a stack of his boring button-downs into the suitcase, his hand brushed a stiff piece of paper tucked under his socks. Another Polaroid. This one was a close-up, just his face, eyes rolled back, and her inked hand tracing the line of his throat. On the back, a scrawled price that would drain the last of their savings, and a time. Now, Elias? You okay? We need to leave in 10 minutes if we're going to beat the traffic, Sarah called from the hallway, her voice light and full of future plans. Just forgot my passport in the kitchen, he shouted back, his voice cracking like drywood. He bolted. He didn't go to the kitchen. He ran to the small charcoal grill on the back patio, fumbling with a lighter. The flame flickered, stubborn and small, as he heard Sarah's footsteps approaching the sliding glass door. Click, click, whoosh. The photo curled, the edges turning a charred, oily black. The image of his betrayal bubbled and liquefied just as the door slid open. The smell of burning chemicals and old ink filled the air. "What are you doing?" Sarah asked, her brow furrowed as she stepped into the heat. "Cleaning out. Old receipts," he panted, kicking the lid of the grill shut. Didn't want to bring the clutter into the new life. She looked at him for a long beat, a second of silence that felt like a forensic examination before she smiled. "You're so weird. Come on, let's go." The drive was 5 hours of agonizing pretense. They arrived at a secluded bed and breakfast by a flat, mirror-still lake. The air was heavy and smelled of pine needles and damp earth. The house was a Victorian relic, all creaking floorboards and faded floral wallpaper, isolated from the rest of the world by miles of dense forest. "It's perfect," Sarah whispered, leaning against him as they stood on the wooden dock, watching the sunset turn the water into a sheet of bruised violet. No phones, no work, no distractions. The silence of the lake was absolute, a jurisdictional blanket that should have felt peaceful. But as Elias looked down into the dark water, he didn't see the reflection of the stars. He saw a jagged, rhythmic ripple moving toward the shore, and the scent of the pine was suddenly cut by a sharp, stinging note of cloves and industrial cleaner. The silence of the bed and breakfast was supposed to be a sanctuary, but it had turned into a resonance chamber. Elias sat on the edge of the four-poster bed, his hands pressed into the quilt. Through the thin, floral-papered walls, the muffled sounds of the neighbors weren't romantic whispers. They were jagged, rhythmic screams. Elias flinched at every word. It was as if the walls were transparent, exposing his own marrow to their fury. He turned toward the small, flickering television in the corner to drown them out. A local news anchor, her face a flat, forensic mask, spoke over a graphic of a yellow-tape crime scene. Police say the motive appears to be a domestic dispute. The victim was found in his car, reportedly targeted after his wife discovered a history of infidelity. "God, that's awful," Sarah murmured from the armchair. She was tucked under a blanket, her eyes fixed on the screen as the program shifted. It was a 60-minute special. The title card flashed in a cold, digital blue, "The Widow's Webs." A narrator with a voice like grinding stones began to chronicle a woman who had spent a decade systematically liquidating the men who had broken their vows. "People are so fragile, aren't they?" Sarah said, not looking away from the screen. One lie, and the whole architecture just falls apart. Elias couldn't breathe. The air in the room had turned suffocating and heavy, smelling of old dust and Sarah's floral perfume, which now seemed to have a sharp, metallic edge. "I need some air," he rasped. He stepped out onto the porch. The temperature had plummeted, a jurisdictional freeze that shouldn't have been possible in midsummer. The lake wasn't blue anymore. It was a sheet of black glass. As he looked into the dense line of pine trees, he felt a rhythmic, heavy presence, something lurking in the shadows that was ancient and unyielding. The trees didn't rustle. They shivered. He retreated inside, his teeth chattering, but the house offered no refuge. As he closed the door, a new sound started. It wasn't the neighbors or the TV. It was a faint, frantic scratching coming from inside the walls. It moved behind the wallpaper, a dry, skittering sound like millions of needles tracing the wood, following him as he moved toward the bed. Sarah didn't seem to hear it. She just sat there in the flickering light of the television, watching the widow explain her methods. Every time Elias managed to drift off, the normal world of the B&B dissolved. The dreams weren't abstract. They were visceral reenactments. He was back in that low-ceilinged apartment, the smell of smoldering sage and warm wax filling his lungs until he choked. He felt the weight of the goth girl on his chest, her translucent skin glowing with that haunting, bioluminescent map of veins. In the dream, he would look over her shoulder and see Sarah standing in the corner of the room, her wedding veil torn and gray, watching him with eyes that were nothing but hollow, lightless pits. He'd bolt upright, gasping, his heart hammering a frantic, broken code against his ribs. The room was freezing, the air thick with a sharp, metallic dampness from the lake. Her touch, once his greatest comfort, now felt like a forensic brand. He would recoil, his skin crawling, drenched in a sweat that felt thicker and oilier than usual. He'd lie there in the dark, listening to the rhythmic, dry scratching in the walls, waiting for his heart to slow down. Then he'd fall back under, and the loop would reset. The voices from the club would return, but now they were chanting the words from the neighbors' fight. "How could you? How could you?" He saw the money he'd paid out, the stacks of hundreds, turning into dead, black leaves in the girl's hands. He saw this starry script of his transgressions written in the condensation on the bedroom windows. He stood up, his legs shaking, and walked to the bathroom. As he splashed cold water on his face, he refused to look in the mirror. He was terrified of who, or what, would be looking back. The exit from the lake was a jagged, frantic departure. In the room next door, the muffled screams had escalated into the rhythmic, violent thud of furniture being overturned. The woman's voice had turned into a raw, shattering howl of betrayal that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and into Elias's very marrow. When the blue and red strobes of the police cruisers finally swept across the floral wallpaper, Sarah had had enough. "That's it. Pack the bags," she said, her voice a flat, forensic line of disappointment. "This place is a jurisdictional disaster. It was supposed to be a sanctuary, and instead, we're listening to a domestic homicide in the making." She was already on her phone as they hauled their suitcases to the silver sedan in the bruised light of the morning. "1 star, Elias. I'm leaving a review before we even hit the highway. If I could give him a 0, I would. This whole weekend is a write-off." As they pulled away from the B&B, Sarah leaned her head against the window and fell into a deep, exhausted sleep, leaving Elias alone with the hum of the tires and the heavy, salt-stained silence of the cabin. The highway was a gray ribbon cutting through miles of dense, skeletal pines. Elias gripped the wheel, his eyes burning from the nights of sweat-drenched nightmares. The guilt was a physical weight now, a mile of cold water pressing against his chest. Then he saw her. About a mile ahead, standing on the gravel shoulder in the middle of nowhere, was a figure in a black leather jacket. She didn't have a bag. She didn't have a sign. She was just standing there with a jagged, frame-skipping grace. As the car drew closer, his heart began to hammer a frantic, broken code. It was the girl from the club. Her ink-black hair was a matted nest, and even at 60 miles an hour, he could swear he smelled that cloying, chemical mix of burnt plastic and lavender. She didn't wave. She didn't look at the car. She just stood there, a dark glitch against the green forest. But as Elias passed her, he looked into the rearview mirror. She was gone. The shoulder was empty, just the gray gravel and the swaying trees. But when he looked back at the road ahead, he noticed a single, wet smudge on the inside of the windshield, a dark, oily fingerprint right in his line of sight. The silver sedan pulled into the driveway like a funeral carriage. Sarah didn't even wait for Elias to grab the bags. She marched inside, muttering about the 0-star honeymoon and the waste of a good vacation. Elias stayed behind, his boots crunching on the pavement. There it was. Tucked into the weather stripping of the front door was another plain white envelope. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He could already feel the cloying scent of cloves leaking through the paper. Something in Elias's mind, the normal, boring architecture he had spent years building, finally snapped. The signal had been overridden. "I have to go back to the hub," he told Sarah, his voice a flat, dead-eyed monotone. "A transformer blew in the industrial district. I'm going to be late. Don't wait up." On our first night back, she called from the kitchen, but Elias was already out the door. He didn't go to the hub. He drove straight to the ossuary. The neon violet sign was flickering in a rhythmic, dying pulse. He found her at the bar, her skin looking like cold, translucent marble in the strobe lights. "The money wasn't enough?" he asked, leaning in until he could smell the burnt plastic on her breath. She smiled, her teeth looking like needle-thin shards of glass. "The audit is never closed, Elias." "Fine," he rasped, a terrifying, forensic clarity taking over his limbs. "I'm paying for the time anyway. One more night. Your place." They moved into the shadows of her apartment, the air thick with the smell of smoldering sage and wax. As she turned to light a candle, Elias didn't reach for her. He reached for the heavy, notched blade he'd hidden under his jacket, a tool for a different kind of maintenance. The first strike caught her in the side of the neck. It wasn't a clean, logical cut. It was a ravaging, physical liquidation. Elias didn't stop. He became a machine of rhythmic, high-speed violence. The knife rose and fell in a frantic, mechanical code, 10 times 15, 20. He felt the warm, heavy splash of her life against his face, but in his drugged, panicked mind, it didn't look like blood. It looked like black, shimmering ink spraying across the floor wallpaper. She didn't scream. With every thrust of the blade, she only laughed, a low-frequency, bubbling hum that vibrated in his marrow. "Do love me," she wheezed, her eyes expanding into two unblinking, violet oceans as she slumped against the mattress. Elias stood over the ruin of her, his breath coming in ragged, salt-stink hitches. The room was silent now, save for the rhythmic, wet drip of the ink hitting the floorboards. He felt a sudden, tectonic surge of euphoria, a sense that the debt had finally been settled. He wiped the blade on the sheets and walked out into the cold, silent night. He felt clean. He felt boring again. The hot water was a forensic scrub, but it couldn't reach the marrow. Elias stood in the shower for 40 minutes, the steam thick and suffocating, smelling of bleach and scalded skin. He turned the dial until the water was a punishing, red-hot needle spray, trying to drown out the sound of the drain. Through the roar of the pipes, he heard it, a low-frequency, rhythmic vibration. It wasn't in the room. It was in the bone behind his ear. "Do you love me, Elias?" He froze, the soap stinging his eyes. It was her voice, but it was layered with the wet, bubbling gargle of her final breath. It sounded like it was being spoken through a mile of salt water. He scrubbed harder, his skin turning a raw, angry crimson, but the whisper followed him into the steam. "The audit is in the air now." He stepped out, shivering, and moved with a jagged, frantic speed. He took the black jeans and the Cure shirt, the fabric still stiff with the matte black, oily residue of her life, and hauled them out to the backyard. The moon was a flat, forensic white. He tossed them into the barbecue, doused them in lighter fluid, and struck a match. The fire didn't burn orange. It flared into a toxic, violet-blue flame that hissed and spat. As the fabric curled into black ash, the smoke didn't rise. It coiled around his ankles like wet kelp. In the hiss of the burning denim, he heard it again, clearer this time, 1,000 voices in a single, high-speed burst. He retreated to the bedroom, sliding under the duvet beside Sarah. She was a warm, breathing anchor of normalcy. But as soon as he closed his eyes, the reboot began. The dreams were a tectonic shift. He wasn't in his bed. He was back in her apartment, but the walls were made of translucent, throbbing rib cages. She was there, reconstructed and shimmering, her 20-plus wounds glowing like neon violet apertures. She crawled across the ceiling with a jagged, insectoid grace, her ink-black hair trailing over his face like cold silk. In the dream, she didn't stab him back. She just leaned down, her mouth unhinging to reveal the rows of vibrating needles, and whispered the question into his open chest. He woke up drenched in a sweat that smelled of burnt plastic and lavender. He looked at Sarah in the gray morning light, and for a split second, her sleeping face flickered, the skin stretching and pale, the eyes threatening to open into unblinking red pixels. He was a man trapped in a loop, and the normal world was starting to look like a poorly rendered mask. The silver sedan rounded the corner, and the world collapsed into a jagged, forensic wreck. His normal life, the wedding gifts, the boring button-downs, the stack of ivory-colored invitations, was strewn across the lawn like the debris of a plane crash. Sarah stood in the center of the carnage, her face a mask of absolute, freezing clarity. She wasn't crying. She was vibrating with a cold, jurisdictional fury. In her hand, she clutched the white envelope. The Polaroids, the acts, the drugs, the betrayal, were splayed out like a deck of tarot cards. "Sarah, I can explain," Elias started, but his voice was a thin, dry rasp. "Explain the starry script." "Elias?" she spat, her voice cracking with a high-frequency scream. "Explain the smell of cloves and rot that's been following you for weeks. Get your things. The marriage is liquidated. I'm filing for a divorce before the ink on the license is even dry." The argument was a blur of tearing sounds and heavy, rhythmic shouting. He tried to grab her arm, but she recoiled as if his skin were made of burning lye. He was a glitch in her life, and she was deleting him. Elias ended up at the Sleep Easy, a Fleabag motel on the edge of the industrial district. The room smelled of stale cigarettes, industrial bleach, and damp carpet. The walls were a sickly, nicotine-stained yellow, and the only light was the toxic red glow of a flickering neon sign outside. He sat on the edge of the saga mattress, his head in his hands. The silence was short-lived. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It started in the wall behind the headboard, a dry, mechanical scratching like millions of needle-thin teeth tracing the wood. Elias froze. It moved with a jagged, frame-skipping speed, circling the room, behind the wallpaper, under the floorboards. Then came the whisper. It didn't come from the hallway. It came from the space between the atoms of the room. A rhythmic thumping began at the door. Not a knock, but a heavy, wet slap, like a piece of raw meat being thrown against the wood. The scratching intensified, the wallpaper beginning to bubble and peel as if something were trying to unhinge the architecture from the other side. Elias backed into the corner, his eyes fixed on the door handle as it began to turn with a slow, deliberate grace. The smell of burnt plastic and lavender began to pour through the vents, thick enough to taste. Elias let out a breath he didn't know he was holding, the sound of a ragged whistle in the cramped motel room. He stared at the screen, transfixed by the sketch. It was absurd. The man in the drawing had a heavy, battered face and a massive neck. He looked like a heavyweight boxer, someone built for high-impact violence. It wasn't Elias. It wasn't the boring guy in the silver sedan with the signal-to-noise spreadsheets. The system had failed, and for once, the failure was his salvation. He was a ghost. He was invisible. But as the reporter continued, the relief turned back into a cold, physical weight. Investigators are baffled by the sheer volume of the scene, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Gallons of fluid have been recovered, far exceeding what a single human body can hold. It's as if the room itself was bled. Elias looked at his hands. He remembered the 20-plus stabs, the rhythmic mechanical thud of the blade. He remembered the spray hitting his face, but he didn't remember a lake of it. The news showed a shot of the apartment's front door. A thick, dark gore was still weeping from the frame, staining the hallway carpet in a wide, heavy circle of rot. And then the anchor dropped the final hammer. Despite the forensic evidence of a fatal struggle, the victim's body remains missing. It's as if she simply evaporated. Elias turned off the TV, the silence of the motel room suddenly feeling pressurized and thick. He was scot-free, but he wasn't alone. If there was no body, where was the weight? If the police were looking for a giant who was scratching his walls? He lay back on the thin mattress, staring at the water-stained ceiling. The chemical smell of burnt plastic and lavender began to drift up from the floorboards again, faint but unmistakable. He tried to tell himself it was just the lingering effect of the drugs, a sensory echo of the girl he had liquidated. But then he heard the floorboards in the hallway outside his room groan under a heavy, slow-motion weight. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't the light, jagged step of the girl. It was the rhythmic, tectonic stride of someone much larger. Someone who sounded exactly like the man in the sketch. The relief of the Mike Tyson sketch was a thin, fragile shield. Elias lay on the motel mattress, staring at the water stains on the ceiling until they blurred into gray static. When sleep finally took him, it didn't drift, it slammed him into a new architecture. Clang. He bolted awake, but he wasn't in the motel. He was in a sensory cage, pinned inside a hollow, metallic womb. There was no air, only a thick, suffocating heat that smelled of scorched brass and old, pressurized death. He tried to thrash, to find a door, but his limbs struck curved, blistering walls of polished metal that radiated a terrifying, forensic heat. A rhythmic, low-frequency roar began to vibrate through the metal floor beneath him. Outside, he heard the faint, distorted hiss of a bellows. The temperature spiked, the air turning into a searing steam that cooked the lining of his throat with every frantic gasp.